Dr. Rebecca Sullivan's scalpel froze mid-incision. The metallic gleam beneath Harold Peterson's skin wasn't supposed to exist in peacetime America. "Nurse, step back," she whispered, her 30 years of surgical experience crumbling like autumn leaves. The tissue peeled away to reveal not the expected lipoma, but fragments of a war that ended before her patients were born. Inside this 78-year-old veteran's foot lay pieces of Korea, 1952, rusted shrapnel wrapped in what appeared to be olive-green fabric, somehow preserved like a time capsule of pain. The infection had been brewing for 70 years, waiting. "Doctor, his vitals are spiking." Nurse Janet's voice cut through the sterile air. Harold's body was rejecting not just the foreign objects, but 7 decades of buried trauma. Outside the operating room, his son David paced, unaware that his father had been carrying an entire battlefield in his flesh, a living memorial to boys who never made it home. Some wounds don't heal because they're not meant to heal alone. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that fateful morning in the operating room, Harold Peterson sat in his favorite recliner, the one Martha had picked out 42 years ago at the furniture store on Broad Street. The burgundy leather had faded to the color of old wine, cracked at the armrests where his hands had gripped it through countless evenings of watching the news, waiting for Martha to call him to dinner. Now, the dinner calls never came. The small ranch house on Maple Avenue felt too big for one person, though Harold would never admit it to his son David. Every morning at precisely 6:30, he shuffled to the kitchen in his worn slippers, the ones Martha had given him 3 Christmases ago, and made exactly 1 cup of coffee in the Mr. Coffee machine that still brewed for 2 out of habit. Harold was 78 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd spent 56 years married to the only woman who ever made sense of his silences. Martha had passed 2 years ago after a brief battle with pancreas's cancer, taking with her the sound of laughter in the hallways and the smell of her famous apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Their son David, now 52 and a family physician with graying temples and his mother's worried eyes, visited every Sunday afternoon like clockwork. He'd arrive at 1 o'clock sharp with groceries Harold didn't need and concern Harold didn't want, fussing over blood pressure medications and doctor appointments with the gentle persistence of someone who'd already lost too much. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. Young families moved in and out like seasons, but Harold remained, tending Martha's rose garden with arthritic hands and feeding the stray tabby cat he'd secretly named Sergeant. The mailman, Tommy Chen, was a Vietnam veteran who understood the weight of memories that followed old soldiers home. Harold's daily routine was simple: morning coffee, reading the Richmond Times-Dispatch obituaries to see which of his contemporaries had passed on, as the euphemistic language always said, and an afternoon walk around the block that had grown shorter each month since Martha's funeral. The pain in his right foot had started small, like a pebble in his shoe that he couldn't shake loose. At first, he'd blamed it on old age, the way 78-year-old bones complained about weather changes and too much standing. Harold Peterson had survived Heartbreak Ridge and 50 years of construction work. A little foot pain wasn't worth mentioning to David, who already carried enough worry for both of them. But worry, like pain, has a way of growing in silence. The small bump beneath his foot, no bigger than a marble at first, had begun to change his careful world. Walking to the mailbox took longer. Climbing the 3 steps to his front porch required the handrail Martha had insisted they install when they were getting older. Harold Peterson was a proud man, a trait that had served him well in war and marriage, but was proving dangerous in the quiet battlefield of growing old alone. The autumn morning when everything changed started like any other Sunday in Harold's carefully ordered world. He woke at 6:15, 5 minutes before his alarm, a habit ingrained from decades of military precision and construction site schedules. The house felt particularly quiet that morning, the kind of silence that seemed to press against his eardrums and remind him that Martha's soft breathing was no longer there to fill the space between his own heartbeats. Harold shuffled to the kitchen, favoring his right foot more than usual. The bump beneath his sole had grown noticeably over the past 2 weeks, transforming from an annoying pebble-sized irritation into something that felt more like a golf ball pressing against the inside of his shoe. Each step sent a dull ache shooting up his leg, but Harold Peterson had learned long ago that acknowledging pain was the first step toward surrendering to it. The Mr. Coffee machine gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with the familiar aroma that had greeted him and Martha for 30 years of mornings. He stood at the window above the sink, watching the neighbor's golden retriever chase fallen leaves across the yard, and tried not to think about how Martha used to stand in this exact spot, humming while she scrambled eggs and planned their day. By 10 o'clock, when David's Honda Accord pulled into the driveway, Harold had already noticed himself gripping the kitchen counter for support while washing his coffee cup. The pain was becoming impossible to ignore, radiating from the sole of his foot up through his calf like electric shocks. "Morning, Dad," David called as he let himself in through the back door, carrying 2 grocery bags and wearing the expression Harold had come to recognize as his son's medical professional trying not to look worried face. "You're limping," David observed, setting the groceries on the counter and immediately shifting into doctor mode. "How long has this been going on?" Harold waved dismissively, settling into his recliner with more care than usual. "Old bones, son. Nothing that won't work itself out." But David had inherited his mother's ability to see through Harold's stoic facade. He knelt beside the recliner, his practiced eyes cataloging the subtle ways his father's body had changed. "Dad, you're favoring that right foot. Let me take a look." "It's nothing serious," Harold protested, but even as he spoke, he was unlacing his worn leather shoe with hands that trembled slightly from the effort of bending forward. When David examined the sole of his father's foot, his expression shifted from casual concern to professional alarm. The bump had grown from the size of a marble to something approaching a walnut, red and warm to the touch, with an angry-looking rash spreading around its edges. "This isn't just a callus or a corn," David said, his voice taking on the careful neutrality he used when delivering difficult news to patients. "How long has it been this size?" Harold looked away, focusing on the framed wedding photo on the side table where he and Martha smiled at each other with the confidence of people who believed they had forever. "Maybe a month. Could be a little longer." "A month?" David's professional composure cracked slightly. "Dad, this could be serious. This kind of rapid growth, the inflammation. We need to get you to a doctor immediately." The argument that followed was the kind that had been building between them for 2 years, ever since Martha's death had left them both navigating grief without her gentle mediation. Harold's stubborn independence crashed against David's protective instincts like waves against a seawall. "I'm not spending my Social Security check on doctors who'll just tell me I'm old," Harold declared, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect on construction sites and Korean battlefields. "This isn't about money," David shot back, frustration bleeding through his careful bedside manner. "This is about your health, about not leaving me to deal with losing you too." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made both men uncomfortable. They rarely spoke directly about Martha's death, or about Harold's increasing isolation, or about David's fear that his father was slowly giving up on life. Tommy Chen's knock on the front door interrupted the tense silence. The mailman had finished his route and stopped by, as he did most Sundays, to check on Harold and share stories about grandchildren and aching joints. "Heard voices getting a little heated," Tommy said, with the diplomatic skill of a man who'd mediated conflicts in Vietnamese villages and suburban neighborhoods alike. "Everything all right here?" David explained the situation while Harold sat silent in his recliner, and Tommy nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched too many proud veterans suffer in silence rather than admit they needed help. "You know," Tommy said carefully, "my nephew had something similar last year. Turned out to be nothing serious, but the peace of mind was worth the doctor visit. Sometimes the fear of not knowing is worse than the knowing itself." By sunset, Harold had agreed to see Dr. Jennifer Hayes at the local clinic the following morning, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but represented the kind of small victory that families build hope upon. The visit to Dr. Jennifer Hayes's clinic on Monday morning had been reassuring in the way that small-town medicine often is, personal, unhurried, and delivered with the kind of bedside manner that made patients feel heard rather than processed. Dr. Hayes, a woman in her 50s with gentle hands and wire-rimmed glasses, had examined Harold's foot with thorough attention while asking about his medical history in a voice that reminded him pleasantly of Martha's sister. "It appears to be a lipoma," she'd explained, pressing gently around the mass. "A fatty tumor. They're quite common in men your age, Mr. Peterson. Completely benign in most cases." She'd recommended monitoring it for changes and prescribed mild pain medication for the discomfort, sending Harold home with instructions to return if the growth accelerated or the pain worsened. For 3 weeks, Harold allowed himself to believe in Dr. Hayes's calm assessment. The pain medication helped, and he convinced himself that the mass wasn't growing significantly. David's Sunday visits became less tense, filled instead with discussions about the changing leaves and plans for Thanksgiving dinner, the first holiday they'd attempt without Martha's organizing presence. But the human body, like grief itself, rarely follows the timeline we set for it. On a crisp November morning, Harold woke to discover that his world had fundamentally shifted overnight. The bump beneath his foot had doubled in size, transforming from a walnut into something approaching a small lemon. More alarming was the angry red streaking that had appeared around the mass, radiating outward like lightning bolts under his skin. When Harold tried to stand for his morning coffee ritual, the pain dropped him back onto the edge of his bed with a gasp that echoed through the empty house. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, and the simple act of putting weight on his right foot sent waves of agony shooting up his leg. By noon, Harold was forced to acknowledge what his pride had been denying for weeks. This was beyond his ability to endure alone. He called David's office, something he'd never done in all the years his son had been practicing medicine. "Dad?" David's voice carried immediate concern. "You never call me at work." "I think maybe you should come over," Harold said, the admission costing him more than the pain itself. "The foot situation has escalated." David arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his face wearing the expression Harold remembered from childhood. Determined concern mixed with barely controlled fear. When he saw his father's foot, David's professional composure wavered visibly. The mass had not only grown dramatically, but had taken on characteristics that violated everything Dr. Hayes had predicted. The skin was hot to the touch, stretched tight over whatever was growing beneath it, and the red streaking suggested a serious infection spreading through Harold's system. "We're going to the emergency room," David announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Right now." "It's probably just—" Harold began, but David cut him off with an authority that reminded Harold that his son was no longer the little boy who'd needed protection from the world's harsh realities. "Dad, this could be sepsis, blood poisoning. People die from this." David's voice cracked slightly on the last words, revealing the fear he'd been carrying since Martha's death, the terror of losing his remaining parent to something preventable. The emergency room at Richmond General was a symphony of controlled chaos that reminded Harold uncomfortably of MASH units in Korea. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency while monitors beeped and overhead pages called doctors to various crises. Harold found himself on a gurney, his foot elevated and surrounded by medical professionals who spoke in the kind of urgent whispers that made patients understand their situation was serious. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the emergency physician, was a man about David's age with steady hands and eyes that had seen enough medical mysteries to be genuinely concerned by what he found. The CT scan results, when they came back an hour later, showed something that made the entire medical team pause. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling into the plastic chair beside Harold's bed with the deliberate movements of someone delivering complicated news. "What we're seeing here isn't consistent with a typical lipoma. The imaging shows what appears to be foreign material embedded within the mass, something metallic, possibly fragments of some kind." Harold's mind immediately flashed to Korea, to the bitter cold of Heartbreak Ridge, and the day a mortar round had exploded close enough to knock him unconscious. He'd woken up in a field hospital with a bandaged leg and a Purple Heart recommendation, but the medics had been overwhelmed with more seriously wounded soldiers. His injury had been classified as minor, some shrapnel, they'd said, but nothing that wouldn't heal. "Could be from the war," Harold said quietly, the words feeling strange after decades of silence about his service. "I was wounded in Korea. Took some shrapnel in that leg." Dr. Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful look with David. "That was over 70 years ago. It's extremely unusual for foreign material to remain dormant that long and then suddenly become active. We need to get you to specialists who understand this kind of trauma." The word trauma hung in the air like a challenge. Harold had spent his entire adult life believing he'd left the war in Korea, that he'd come home clean and whole to build a life with Martha. The possibility that he'd been carrying pieces of that battlefield inside his body all these years felt like a betrayal of everything he'd told himself about survival and healing. "Walter Reed Medical Center," David said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "They have specialists who work with veterans, with cases like this." As the ambulance was called and transfer arrangements made, Harold closed his eyes and tried to reconcile the man he'd believed himself to be with the man he was discovering he'd always been, a soldier who'd never really left the war behind. Walter Reed Medical Center rose from the Maryland landscape like a monument to military medicine, its imposing facade reflecting decades of treating America's wounded warriors. As Harold was wheeled through the automatic doors on a crisp December morning, he felt the familiar weight of institutional authority that had defined so much of his young adulthood. The antiseptic smell and echoing corridors transported him back to field hospitals in Korea, where the boundary between life and death had been measured in tourniquets and morphine doses. Dr. Rebecca Sullivan met them in the orthopedic surgery wing, her confident stride and direct manner immediately commanding Harold's respect. At 45, she possessed the kind of professional presence that came from years of dealing with complex military medical cases. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp with intelligence, and when she spoke about Harold's condition, her words carried the weight of someone who understood both the science of healing and the psychology of soldiers. "Mr. Peterson, I've reviewed your imaging from Richmond General," she said, settling into the consultation room chair with Harold's thick medical file spread before her. "What we're dealing here is highly unusual. The foreign material embedded in your foot appears to have been encapsulated by your body's natural healing response for over 7 decades. Something has recently changed to make it active again." David leaned forward, his medical training evident in the precise questions he asked about infection markers, surgical options, and long-term prognosis. But Harold found himself studying Dr. Sullivan's face, noting the small American flag pin on her white coat lapel and the way she addressed him as "Sir" with genuine respect rather than perfunctory politeness. "Doctor, I need to ask you something," Harold said, his voice carrying the formal cadence he'd learned in the Army. "Are you military?" Dr. Sullivan smiled, an expression that softened her professional demeanor. Navy. 2 tours as a field surgeon in Afghanistan. My father was a Korean War veteran, Mr. Peterson. He carried his own invisible wounds for 60 years before we understood what we were dealing with. The connection was immediate and profound. Harold felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. For the first time since Martha's death, he was speaking with someone who understood not just his medical condition, but the complex psychology of men who'd learned to carry pain in silence. Over the following days, Walter Reed became Harold's temporary home as a team of specialists conducted the most comprehensive medical evaluation of his life. Dr. Sullivan coordinated with infectious disease experts, military historians, and even Pentagon archivists who helped piece together the medical records from Harold's Korean War service. The portrait that emerged was both heroic and heartbreaking. Harold Peterson had been 19 years old when he'd enlisted, a farm boy from Virginia who'd never been more than 50 miles from home. The Battle of Heartbreak Ridge had been his baptism by fire, a brutal engagement where his unit had been ambushed and pinned down for 18 hours under heavy artillery fire. Military records, declassified and digitized decades after the fact, revealed the full story that Harold had never told his family. When a mortar round exploded near his position, shrapnel had torn through his right leg, but Harold had continued fighting. Over the next 6 hours, he'd crawled across open ground 3 separate times to drag wounded comrades to safety, earning a Bronze Star for valor that he'd never mentioned to Martha or David. The field hospital treatment had been cursory at best. Overwhelmed medics had removed the most obvious shrapnel fragments, sutured the wounds, and sent Harold back to duty within a week. What they'd missed were smaller pieces embedded deep in the muscle tissue, fragments that Harold's young, healthy body had simply grown around and forgotten. Your immune system essentially built a wall around the foreign material, Dr. Sullivan explained during one of their daily consultations. For 70 years, your body has been fighting a low-grade battle you weren't even aware of. The recent activation is likely connected to stress, grief, or changes in your immune function. The implications hit Harold like a physical blow. Every ache and pain he'd attributed to age or hard work, every moment Martha had massaged his feet and legs during their long marriage, every night he'd tossed and turned with discomfort he couldn't explain. His body had been processing trauma he'd thought he'd left on a Korean hillside. David struggled with his own revelation. All those years, Mom would rub your legs and feet every evening. She always said you worked too hard, but she knew, didn't she? She knew something was wrong. Harold's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Martha's funeral. She never said anything. 56 years of marriage, and she never once complained about taking care of what I couldn't even admit was there. The pre-surgical preparations revealed the full complexity of Harold's case. Advanced imaging showed that the shrapnel fragments had become integrated into his bone and soft tissue in ways that defied standard surgical protocols. Removing them would require unprecedented precision, with risks that included permanent nerve damage, chronic pain, or worse. Dr. Sullivan assembled a surgical team that included specialists from multiple disciplines. The Pentagon expressed interest in documenting the procedure for future cases involving aging veterans with embedded foreign materials. Harold found himself at the center of medical attention that felt both overwhelming and strangely validating. There are probably thousands of Korean and Vietnam veterans walking around with similar situations, Dr. Sullivan told him during their final pre-surgical meeting. Your case could help us understand how to treat them before they reach crisis points. The revelation transformed Harold's understanding of his own story. He wasn't just a sick old man facing dangerous surgery. He was a representative of an entire generation of warriors whose sacrifices had extended far beyond their years of active service. The weight of representing his generation both honored and humbled him. Tommy Chen visited from Richmond, making the drive with a car full of neighbors who wanted to show support. The waiting room filled with people Harold barely knew but who felt connected to his story. Other veterans, military families, and Richmond neighbors who'd watched him tend Martha's garden and thought they knew the quiet man who lived on Maple Avenue. "You know what this means, don't you?" Tommy said during one of their conversations. "All those years you thought you came home clean from the war. You were still fighting it. Every day for 70 years, you were still fighting." Harold nodded, finally understanding why certain sounds had always made him flinch, why he'd never been able to sleep deeply, why he'd chosen construction work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. His body had been a battlefield, and Martha had been his field medic, tending wounds she couldn't see but somehow knew were there. The night before surgery, Harold called David to his bedside at the medical center. The conversation they'd avoided for 2 years finally broke open like a dam, releasing decades of accumulated pressure. "Son, if something happens to me tomorrow, I need you to know some things about your mother and me," Harold began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "She knew about the nightmares, the pain, the way I'd sometimes go quiet for days. She never asked me to explain because she understood that some things can't be put into words." David gripped his father's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a lifetime spent building and protecting and enduring. "She loved you through it all, didn't she?" "More than that," Harold said, his voice thick with memory. "She loved me because of it all. She saw the man the war had made me, the good and the broken parts, and she decided that was worth a lifetime of taking care of." As dawn approached and the surgical team prepared for what would be either Harold's salvation or his final battle, both men understood that they were about to discover not just what Harold's body had been carrying, but what strength Martha's love had given him to carry it. The operating room at Walter Reed Medical Center hummed with the quiet efficiency of military precision. Dr. Rebecca Sullivan stood at the scrubbed sink, watching the clock tick toward 7:30 as she performed the ritual cleansing that had preceded thousands of surgeries throughout her career. This morning felt different, weighted with the significance of what they were about to attempt. In 30 years of orthopedic surgery, she had never encountered a case quite like Harold Peterson's. The surgical team assembled with the solemnity of soldiers preparing for battle. Dr. James Mitchell, the infectious disease specialist, positioned himself at the monitoring station where he could track Harold's vital signs and watch for any indication that disturbing the decades-old foreign material might trigger a systemic reaction. Nurse Janet Martinez, a 20-year veteran of military surgical procedures, arranged the specialized instruments that might be needed to extract shrapnel that had become part of Harold's body. Harold lay on the operating table, his weathered face peaceful under anesthesia, unaware that his son David stood in the observation gallery above, gripping the rail with white knuckles. David had assisted in hundreds of surgeries during his medical training, but watching his own father under the harsh surgical lights felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. "Beginning initial incision," Dr. Sullivan announced to the room, her voice steady despite the complexity of what lay ahead. The scalpel moved with practiced precision through skin that bore the accumulated scars of 78 years of life. Construction accidents, childhood mishaps, and now this hidden reminder of a war fought when the world was young. The first layer of tissue revealed what the imaging had suggested: inflammation and infection surrounding something that didn't belong in human anatomy. But as Dr. Sullivan continued the careful dissection, the true scope of Harold's condition began to emerge like an archaeological excavation of trauma. "Jesus Christ," whispered Dr. Mitchell, leaning forward to get a better view of what the surgeon was uncovering. Embedded in Harold's foot, wrapped in layers of scar tissue and inflammatory response, were not just fragments of Korean War shrapnel. There were pieces of his old military uniform, threads of olive-drab fabric that had somehow been driven into the wound and preserved by his body's attempt to isolate the foreign material. Small fragments of leather, possibly from his combat boots, had calcified into formations that resembled tiny fossils. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Sullivan said, her voice filled with wonder and concern. "His body has essentially created a museum of that battlefield inside his foot. The immune response has been ongoing for 70 years. The surgical team worked in fascinated silence as they cataloged each discovery. Pieces of Korean soil, mineralized and integrated into Harold's bone structure. Metal fragments that had oxidized and spread trace elements throughout the surrounding tissue. Most remarkably, what appeared to be fragments of other soldiers' equipment, a piece of dog tag, a button from a uniform that wasn't Harold's, suggesting that the explosion that wounded him had created a grotesque mixing of multiple casualties. Dr. Mitchell monitored Harold's vital signs with growing concern. Blood pressure's climbing, heart rate increasing. His body is reacting to the disturbance of these materials. "How long has he been under?" Dr. Sullivan asked, not looking up from her delicate work. 2 hours, 15 minutes, Nurse Martinez replied. "Blood loss is within normal parameters, but his inflammatory markers are spiking." In the observation gallery, David watched his father's vital signs fluctuate on the monitors, each irregular heartbeat sending waves of anxiety through his chest. Tommy Chen had arrived from Richmond and stood beside him, both men united in their helpless vigil over a warrior who had spent 7 decades fighting a battle he didn't know he was fighting. The most challenging moment came when Dr. Sullivan reached the deepest embedded fragments. A piece of shrapnel, roughly the size of a dime, had lodged against Harold's heel bone and become partially integrated into the bone structure itself. Removing it would require precision that bordered on artistry, with any mistake potentially leaving Harold permanently disabled. "Talk to me about options," Dr. Sullivan said to her team, pausing with her instruments poised above the critical area. "We could leave it," Dr. Mitchell suggested. "The infection appears to be contained around the other fragments. This piece might not be contributing to the current crisis." Dr. Sullivan studied the imaging screens, weighing years of surgical experience against the unknown risks of disturbing something that had remained stable for decades. But as she considered leaving the fragment in place, Harold's body made the decision for her. His blood pressure spiked dramatically, and the monitors began alarming as his heart rate climbed toward dangerous levels. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Patricia Wong, leaned over her equipment with growing concern. "He's fighting the anesthesia," she announced. "It's like his body knows we're here and wants to wake up." "Increase the propofol," Dr. Sullivan ordered. But even as she spoke, she could see Harold's eyelids beginning to flutter. In that moment of medical crisis, something extraordinary happened. Harold's lips began to move, forming words that the surgical team could barely hear but somehow understood. He was calling names: Jimmy, Rodriguez, Patterson, the names of soldiers who had died on Heartbreak Ridge 70 years ago. "He's reliving the battle," Dr. Mitchell said quietly. "The surgical trauma is triggering a flashback response." Dr. Sullivan faced an impossible decision. Continue the surgery while Harold's psyche battled through decades-old trauma, or abort the procedure and leave him with a potentially life-threatening infection. But, as she hesitated, Harold's vitals suddenly stabilized. His breathing deepened, and his face relaxed into peaceful unconsciousness. "What just happened?" Nurse Martinez asked. Dr. Wong checked her equipment, shaking her head in professional confusion. His brain activity just changed completely. It's like he made a conscious decision to trust us and let go. With renewed determination, Dr. Sullivan returned to the deepest fragment. And the extraction required 45 minutes of microscopic precision, carefully separating bone that had grown around metal, tissue that had adapted to foreign materials, and removing the physical remnants of a war that had ended before most of the surgical team was born. When the last piece of shrapnel came free, the operating room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors indicating that Harold Peterson was stable, whole, and finally free of the battlefield he'd been carrying in his body. "Specimen collection complete," Dr. Sullivan announced, looking at the array of foreign materials they had removed. "Begin closure." The fragments, cleaned and catalogued, told the story of a 19-year-old soldier's courage and sacrifice in ways that no military citation could capture. Each piece represented a moment when Harold had chosen to save others rather than protect himself, carrying not just physical remnants, but the molecular memory of heroism in his very bones. As the surgical team began the meticulous process of closing Harold's wound, Dr. Sullivan found herself thinking about the thousands of veterans who might be walking around with similar hidden burdens. Harold's case would change how military medicine approached long-term care for combat veterans, but more immediately, it would change how one family understood the true cost of service and sacrifice. In the observation gallery, David wept openly as he watched his father's vital signs return to normal ranges for the first time in months. Tommy Chen placed a weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder, offering the silent comfort that veterans learn to give each other when words are insufficient. "He's going to be okay," David whispered. Though whether he was speaking to Tommy or to the spirit of his mother, neither man could say. "Doctor." Sullivan stepped back from the operating table, looking at Harold's peaceful face and thinking about the conversation she would have with him when he woke up. How do you tell a man that he has been a hero not just for one day on a Korean hillside, but for every day since then, carrying the weight of his service in ways he never knew? The surgery was complete, but Harold Peterson's real healing was just beginning. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came 18 hours after surgery, when Harold's temperature spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit and his blood pressure plummeted to levels that sent the ICU monitors into a symphony of urgent alarms. Dr. Sullivan rushed to his bedside at 3 in the morning, her scrubs hastily thrown over pajamas, to find Harold's body locked in a battle that medical science was struggling to understand. "What are his white cell counts?" she asked Nurse Rodriguez, who had been monitoring Harold through the night shift with the dedicated attention of someone who understood that this case represented uncharted medical territory. "Climbing exponentially," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with concern. "It's like his immune system is attacking everything at once." "The infection markers are unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of ICU work." David sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his father's bed, holding Harold's hand and feeling the fever burning through his father's skin like a furnace. The successful surgery had given way to a medical crisis that seemed to mock their earlier optimism. Harold's body, after 70 years of containing the foreign materials, was responding to their removal with a systemic inflammatory response that threatened to destroy him. "The bacteria we cultured from the surgical site," Dr. Sullivan explained to David, her voice carrying the weight of delivering impossible news. "Some of these organisms are strains we've never encountered before. They've been isolated in your father's body since 1952, evolving separately from anything in our current medical databases." The implications were staggering. Harold's immune system had been fighting a contained war for 7 decades, developing antibodies and responses to bacterial strains that had effectively time-traveled from the Korean War era. When the surgery disrupted this delicate balance, it had released pathogens that modern antibiotics couldn't recognize or combat effectively. Tommy Chen arrived from Richmond at dawn, having driven through the night when David called with updates. He found his friend unconscious, connected to ventilators and IV drips that turned the hospital room into a technological cocoon of desperate medical intervention. Tommy had seen too many good men die in hospital beds after surviving the battles that should have killed them, and the sight of Harold fighting for his life triggered memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. "This isn't how it's supposed to end," Tommy whispered to David, both men united in their helpless vigil. Not after everything he survived. Not after carrying this burden for so long without knowing it. Dr. Mitchell, the infectious disease specialist, had been working around the clock with laboratory technicians and CDC consultants, trying to identify treatment protocols for bacterial strains that predated modern antibiotic development. The preliminary cultures showed organisms that had adapted to survive in human tissue for decades, creating resistance patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about infection control. "We're essentially treating diseases from 1952, Dr. Mitchell explained during one of the crisis meetings that punctuated Harold's deteriorating condition. His body has been a living laboratory for bacterial evolution, and we're seeing the results of 70 years of isolated development." The medical team tried everything in their arsenal: broad-spectrum antibiotics, antifungal medications, experimental protocols designed for antibiotic-resistant infections. Harold's condition continued to worsen, his kidneys showing signs of failure as his body struggled to process the toxins being released by the dying bacteria that had been part of his biological ecosystem for longer than most of the medical staff had been alive. On the third day of crisis, David faced the conversation no son wants to have with medical professionals. Dr. Sullivan and the intensive care team gathered in the small conference room adjacent to the ICU to discuss end-of-life options and the possibility that Harold's body simply couldn't survive the liberation from its 7-decade burden. "We need to talk about your father's wishes," Dr. Sullivan said gently, her professional composure barely containing her own frustration at being unable to save a man who had already survived so much. "The next 48 hours will be critical. If we can't get the infection under control..." David struggled with the cruel irony that saving his father from the war might be what finally killed him. Harold had carried Korean shrapnel and bacterial hitchhikers for longer than David had been alive, and the surgical intervention that should have freed him was triggering a systemic collapse that threatened to end everything. The turning point came at the worst possible moment. Harold's vital signs had been deteriorating for 6 hours when he suddenly went into cardiac arrest, his heart stopping as his body finally surrendered to the overwhelming infection. The ICU team responded with practiced efficiency, performing CPR and administering emergency medications while David watched his father's life hang in the balance. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Harold Peterson was clinically dead. The monitors showed flat lines where heartbeats should have been, and the medical team worked frantically to restart the biological processes that had sustained him through nearly 8 decades of life. David found himself praying to the same God that Martha had always trusted, begging for more time with the father he was finally beginning to understand. When Harold's heart resumed beating, his first words were barely audible whispers that the medical staff initially dismissed as post-resuscitation confusion. But David leaned close and heard his father calling the names of soldiers who had died on Heartbreak Ridge, as if he had been with them during those 4 minutes of clinical death and was now reporting back from a reunion that medical science couldn't explain. "Jimmy says it's not my time yet," Harold whispered, his eyes still closed but his voice carrying a clarity that contradicted his physical condition. "Rodriguez wants me to tell his daughter he's proud of her. Patterson says the pain stops when you stop fighting it." The medical team exchanged glances that mixed professional skepticism with the kind of awe that comes from witnessing something beyond their training. Harold's vital signs began stabilizing in ways that defied the trajectory of his condition, as if his brief journey into clinical death had somehow reset his body's response to the infection. Dr. Sullivan would later describe Harold's recovery as one of the most remarkable cases in her career. The near-death experience seemed to trigger a fundamental change in his immune response, as if his body had finally received permission to stop fighting the war it had been carrying for 70 years. But even as Harold's physical condition began to improve, David realized that his father had crossed a threshold that went beyond medical recovery. The man who woke up from the cardiac arrest was somehow different, older and younger simultaneously, carrying a peace that hadn't been there before the surgery, but also bearing the weight of conversations with dead soldiers that no living person should have to remember. The tragedy wasn't that Harold had nearly died, it was that he had spent 70 years dying slowly from wounds that everyone, including himself, had forgotten existed. The real tragedy was that Martha had died without knowing the full truth about the burden her husband had carried, and that David had spent 2 years grieving alone when his father had been grieving just as deeply, just as silently, for just as long. The breakthrough came on Harold's 7th day in intensive care, when Dr. Sullivan received a phone call that would change everything they thought they knew about his case. The caller was Colonel James Morrison, a Pentagon archivist who had been following Harold's story through military medical channels and had spent the past week digging through classified Korean War records that hadn't seen daylight in 7 decades. "Dr. Sullivan, I need to speak with you about Sergeant Peterson immediately." Colonel Morrison's voice carried the urgency of someone who had uncovered information that couldn't wait for normal bureaucratic channels. "What I've found changes everything about his case." Within hours, Colonel Morrison arrived at Walter Reed with a briefcase full of declassified documents, medical records, and battlefield reports that painted a picture of heroism far beyond what Harold had ever revealed to his family. The official record showed that Harold Peterson hadn't just been wounded at Heartbreak Ridge. He had single-handedly saved the lives of 7 soldiers while carrying shrapnel wounds that should have incapacitated him. "Your patient didn't just take shrapnel from one explosion," Colonel Morrison explained to the assembled medical team and David. "According to these witness statements, he was wounded in the initial mortar attack but continued fighting for 6 hours. He was hit by shrapnel from at least 3 separate explosions while dragging wounded men to safety." The documents revealed that Harold had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, not just the Bronze Star he had received. The paperwork had been lost in the chaos of a field hospital that was overrun 2 days after Harold's treatment, and the witnesses who could have testified to his actions had been killed or wounded themselves in subsequent fighting. But the most shocking revelation came in the form of a medical report filed by Army medic Robert Chen, Tommy's older brother, who had died in Korea 3 months after treating Harold. The report, written in the cramped handwriting of someone working under battlefield conditions, described attempting to remove shrapnel from multiple soldiers who had been wounded in the same attack. Due to overwhelming casualties and limited surgical facilities, the report read, complete removal of foreign materials not possible for Sergeant Peterson. Patient refused evacuation, insisted on returning to duty. Fragments from other casualties may have been inadvertently included during field treatment of multiple wounded soldiers simultaneously. Dr. Sullivan felt the pieces of the medical puzzle finally falling into place. Harold hadn't just been carrying his own shrapnel for 70 years. He had been carrying fragments from the other soldiers he had saved, mixed together during the desperate field surgery that had tried to patch up multiple casualties with limited resources and time. "This explains the dog tag fragment, the button, the pieces of equipment that didn't match his service records," Dr. Sullivan said, her voice filled with amazement. "He's been carrying physical pieces of the men he saved." David struggled to process the implications of what they were learning. His father hadn't just been a Korean War veteran with hidden wounds, he had been a living memorial to American soldiers. carrying their literal essence in his body while living a quiet life in Richmond, Virginia, never speaking of the burden he bore or the heroism it represented. The medical mystery began to resolve as well. The bacterial strains that had nearly killed Harold weren't just evolved pathogens from the Korean War era, they were bacterial communities that had developed from the mixed blood and tissue of multiple soldiers, creating a unique ecosystem that had been sustained in Harold's body for 7 decades. His immune system had been fighting not just his own infection, but infections from 7 different soldiers, maintaining a biological remembrance of American sacrifice that medical science had never encountered. Tommy Chen wept openly when he learned that his brother Robert had been the medic who treated Harold. The cosmic coincidence of their friendship, the fact that Tommy had been the one to convince Harold to seek medical treatment, felt like divine intervention orchestrated across decades of unconscious connection. "My brother saved your father's life in 1952, Tommy said to David, his voice thick with emotion. "And somehow, 70 years later, I helped save it again." Robert would have said that's not coincidence, that's brothers in arms taking care of each other across time. But the most profound revelation came when Colonel Morrison produced the final document in his briefcase. A letter that Harold had dictated to a chaplain while recovering in the field hospital, believing he might not survive his wounds. The letter, never sent because Harold had recovered and returned to duty, was addressed to his future wife, though he hadn't yet met Martha. "To the woman I hope to marry someday," Harold had dictated. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home from Korea. But I want you to know that I died trying to save my brothers. I hope you can understand that some things are worth carrying forever, even if they hurt. I hope you'll forgive me for not being able to leave the war behind completely, because part of it will always be part of me." David read the letter aloud to Harold's unconscious form, and for the first time since the cardiac arrest, Harold's eyes opened fully. The clarity in his gaze suggested that he was not only conscious but somehow aware of everything that had been revealed about his case. "She knew," Harold whispered, his first coherent word since the near-death experience. "Martha knew I was carrying them with me. Every night when she rubbed my feet, every time she said my leg was bothering me, she was taking care of all of us." The emotional revelation proved to be the catalyst for Harold's physical recovery, as if the disclosure of his 70-year secret had removed the last barrier to healing. His infection markers began dropping dramatically. The bacterial communities that had threatened his life suddenly responded to antibiotic treatments, as if acknowledging that their purpose, preserving the memory of fallen soldiers, had been fulfilled through revelation rather than concealment. Dr. Sullivan documented the case with the fascination of someone witnessing medical history. Harold's recovery challenged fundamental assumptions about trauma, memory, and the ways that bodies process and preserve experiences that the conscious mind chooses to forget. His immune system had essentially been running a biological memorial service for 7 decades, maintaining the cellular memory of American soldiers who had died far from home. The Pentagon expressed interest in studying Harold's case as part of broader research into the long-term health effects of combat trauma. His blood samples contained antibodies to diseases that had been eradicated decades ago, and his tissue showed adaptation patterns that could inform treatment for other aging veterans carrying similar hidden burdens. But for David, the medical significance paled beside the personal revelation of who his father really was. Harold Peterson wasn't just a quiet construction worker who had served in Korea. He was a living monument to American heroism, a man who had literally carried the sacrifice of others in his body while building a life dedicated to family and community service. "All those years I thought you were just my dad," David said, holding Harold's hand as his father's strength slowly returned. "I never understood that you were also a guardian, carrying the memory of soldiers who never got to come home and build families of their own." Harold squeezed his son's hand with surprising strength. "Your mother understood. She always said I was taking care of more than just you and her, but she never asked me to explain. She just loved all of us, me and the boys I carried, without needing to know the details." As Harold's recovery progressed, the medical team began planning for his discharge with the understanding that they were releasing not just a patient, but a living piece of American military history. The shrapnel and foreign materials removed from his foot would be studied by researchers for years to come, but more importantly, Harold would return to Richmond carrying the knowledge of who he really was and what he had sacrificed. The revelation had transformed tragedy into understanding, medical crisis into historical discovery, and a dying old man into a recognized American hero whose service had never truly ended. Harold Peterson had come to Walter Reed Medical Center as a patient with a mysterious foot problem and was leaving as a documented guardian of American military memory, finally free to honor both his own survival and the sacrifice of the soldiers he had carried with him for 70 years. 6 months after the surgery that changed everything, Harold Peterson sat in Martha's garden on a warm June morning, his bare feet touching the earth for the first time in 70 years without pain. The roses Martha had planted were in full bloom, their red petals catching the early sunlight like drops of memory made manifest. For the first time since her death, Harold could tend the garden without the constant ache that had been his companion since Korea, and the simple act of walking on grass felt like a miracle he was still learning to accept. David arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, as he had every Saturday since Harold's discharge from Walter Reed. Their relationship had transformed in ways that neither man had expected, built on a foundation of truth that had been buried for 7 decades. David no longer visited out of duty or worry, but from genuine desire to spend time with a father he was finally beginning to understand. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" David asked, settling into the lawn chair beside Harold's, both men comfortable now with conversations that would have been impossible before the surgery. "Light," Harold replied, a word that had become his standard answer to questions about his physical condition. "I keep expecting the pain to come back, like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it's been 6 months, and I think I'm finally starting to believe this is real." The physical recovery had been remarkable, but the emotional healing had been even more profound. Harold had begun attending therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Reeves, a counselor who specialized in geriatric trauma and understood the complex psychology of men who had carried secrets for lifetimes. Through their weekly sessions, Harold was learning to process not just his own war experience, but the guilt he'd carried about surviving when others hadn't. Tommy Chen joined them in the garden, as he did most Saturday mornings, bringing coffee and the newspaper and the easy companionship of someone who understood the weight of military service. The 3 men had developed a routine of sitting together in the garden, sharing stories and silence in equal measure, creating the kind of brotherhood that forms between people who faced mortality together. "Got a letter from the Pentagon yesterday," Harold said, pulling an official envelope from his shirt pocket. "They want to include my case in the new Veteran Health Initiative. Dr. Sullivan thinks there might be hundreds of Korean and Vietnam veterans walking around with similar conditions." The letter was one of many that had arrived since word of Harold's case had spread through military medical channels. Researchers wanted to study his blood samples. Historians wanted to interview him about battlefield conditions in Korea, and veteran advocacy groups wanted to use his story to push for better long-term care for aging soldiers. But the most meaningful correspondence had come from unexpected sources. Families of soldiers who had died at Heartbreak Ridge had somehow learned about Harold's case and reached out to express gratitude that someone had been carrying the physical memory of their loved ones. A woman in Ohio had written to thank Harold for carrying her father's dog tag fragment. A family in Texas had sent photos of the uncle whose uniform button had been found in Harold's foot. "It's like Martha always said," Harold reflected, looking at the roses that seemed more vibrant than they had in years. Everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see the reason at the time. I spent 70 years thinking I was just carrying pain, but I was really carrying love. The garden had become a gathering place for people whose lives had been touched by Harold's story. Eleanor Matthews, the widow who lived 3 houses down, had started joining their Saturday morning coffee sessions. What had begun as neighborly concern had gradually developed into something deeper, though Harold was still learning to navigate the possibility of companionship after 56 years of marriage to Martha. "Eleanor's bringing pie this afternoon," Harold mentioned, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the slight smile that crossed his face. "Said she wants to try Martha's apple recipe, but she needs someone to taste test it." David and Tommy exchanged knowing looks. Harold's friendship with Eleanor had been developing slowly, built on shared experiences of loss and the careful courtship of people who understood that late-in-life love required different considerations than youthful romance. The transformation in Harold extended beyond his physical healing and budding relationship with Eleanor. He had begun speaking at local veteran events, sharing his story with other aging soldiers who carried their own invisible wounds. His message was simple but powerful. It's never too late to seek help, and shame about needing care only multiplies the burden of service. "Spoke at the VFW in Fredericksburg last week," Harold told David. 3 men came up afterward to say they'd been dealing with unexplained pain for decades. One of them is going to Walter Reed next month for evaluation. The speaking engagements had given Harold a sense of purpose that had been missing since Martha's death. He was no longer just a lonely widower marking time until his own death, but an advocate for his generation of veterans, using his experience to help others find healing they might not have known was possible. Dr. Sullivan visited Harold monthly for follow-up appointments that had become as much social calls as medical consultations. She had published Harold's case in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the response from the medical community had been overwhelming. Harold Peterson had become the index case for a new understanding of how bodies process and preserve trauma, leading to treatment protocols that were helping veterans across the country. "Your case has already helped 12 other veterans get proper treatment," Dr. Sullivan told Harold during her most recent visit. "Men who've been carrying shrapnel and foreign materials for decades, suffering in silence because they thought it was just part of getting old." The knowledge that his suffering had led to help for others gave Harold's experience a meaning that transcended personal healing. He had spent 70 years as an unknowing guardian of fallen soldiers' memory, and now he was serving as a beacon for living veterans who needed to know that healing was possible even decades after service. The afternoon brought the usual collection of visitors who had become part of Harold's extended family. Eleanor arrived with her promised pie and stayed to help tend the roses. Neighbors stopped by to check on Harold and share news from the community. The house that had felt too empty after Martha's death now filled regularly with voices and laughter and the kind of connection that Harold had thought was gone forever. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Harold and David sat on the front porch where Martha used to shell peas and watch the neighborhood children play. The similarity to their old routine was comforting, but the conversation was deeper now, built on honesty that had been impossible when Harold was still carrying secrets. "I keep thinking about Mom," David said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "How she knew something was wrong but never pushed you to explain. How she took care of wounds she couldn't see." Harold nodded, his eyes growing moist as they always did when he thought about Martha's quiet strength. "She was tougher than any soldier I ever knew. Spent 56 years fighting a war she didn't understand, taking care of casualties she couldn't identify. Never once complained about the extra duty." The evening air carried the scent of Martha's roses and the distant sound of children playing in nearby yards. Harold felt a peace that had eluded him for 7 decades, the kind of contentment that comes from finally understanding the full scope of love and sacrifice that had shaped his life. "You know what I realized?" Harold said, his voice soft with wonder. "I thought the war followed me home, but I was wrong. The war never ended because I was never supposed to leave it behind. I was supposed to carry it, to honor it, to make sure those boys weren't forgotten. Martha understood that before I did." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Harold Peterson sat on his front porch, finally at peace with the weight he had carried and the love that had sustained him through 7 decades of unconscious service. He was no longer just a survivor of the Korean War, but a living testament to the bonds between soldiers that transcend time, distance, and even death itself. The boy who had gone to war in 1952 had finally come home, not because the battle was over, but because he had learned to honor both the living and the dead with equal grace. For 70 years, Harold Peterson carried the weight of heroes in his very bones, never knowing that his body had become a living memorial to the boys who didn't make it home from Korea. Like so many of our greatest generation, he suffered in silence, believing that acknowledging pain meant admitting weakness. But when surgeons at Walter Reed opened his infected foot, they found something extraordinary. Fragments of fellow soldiers, pieces of uniforms, even a dog tag from a buddy who died saving others. Harold hadn't just survived the war. He'd been honoring the fallen with every painful step for 7 decades. This isn't just Harold's story. It's the story of an entire generation that came home carrying invisible wounds, tended by wives who loved them through nightmares they couldn't explain, raised children who never knew the full depth of their father's sacrifice. Harold found peace not by forgetting the past, but by finally understanding that some burdens are meant to be carried with pride, not shame. His body had been a temple of remembrance, and Martha's love had been the prayer that sustained it. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from letting go, but from finally understanding what we've been holding on to, and why it was worth carrying all along. What invisible burdens have you carried that might actually be badges of honor? Have you ever discovered that something you thought was weakness was actually a testament to your strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.